I spent 38 years running a small fleet of tow trucks and a salvage yard outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, building something slowly and carefully enough that by the time I retired, I had $380,000 sitting in a conservative retirement account, the kind of number that felt, to a man who grew up with nothing, like actual security. I want to tell you how my own son talked me into handing a third of it to him for a real estate deal that never existed, and how my daughter found out where the money had actually gone before it was too late to get any of it back. My name is Dale Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. My wife, Sherry, passed 6 years ago from lung cancer, and since then it's been me rattling around a house that used to be full of noise, though my 2 children, both grown, both settled nearby, still make sure I'm not entirely alone in it. My son, Bryce, 39, works in commercial real estate, or at least that's the career he's described to the family for the better part of a decade, moving between different brokerages and, more recently, striking out on his own as an independent investor putting together deals he'd bring to friends and family. My daughter, Kimberly, 42, is a certified public accountant with her own small practice in Broken Arrow, meticulous in a way that used to occasionally annoy her brother growing up and turned out, in the end, to be exactly the trait that saved me from losing far more than I already had. Welcome to Revenge Confirmed. Get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. I want to be honest about something before this story goes any further, because it matters to how everything unfolded. I've always been proud of Bryce, the way a lot of fathers are proud of a son who seems to move confidently through a world of finance and deal-making that the father himself never fully understood. I ran tow trucks and a salvage yard. I understood engines, insurance settlements, the particular rhythm of a business built on other people's bad days. Bryce talked in terms of cap rates and appreciation curves and off-market opportunities, language that always sounded, to my ear, like a more sophisticated version of the same hustle I'd spent my own career practicing in a dirtier uniform. About 16 months ago, Bryce came to Sunday dinner with a folder of paperwork, the way these stories always seem to start with a folder of paperwork, laid out on the counter before we'd even sat down to eat. He'd found what he described as a genuinely rare opportunity, a small commercial strip center in Owasso, undervalued because the current owner needed a fast sale to cover an unrelated debt, the kind of deal, he explained, that only comes along a handful of times in a career if you're paying attention and moving quickly. He had it under contract already, he said, at a price well below market value, with a projected return, once renovated and re-leased at market rates, of nearly 40% within 18 months. He needed $120,000 to close, on top of what he'd already secured from a couple of other private investors, and he was offering me, as family, the same terms those investors were getting, a documented promissory note with quarterly interest payments and a full principal return plus profit share at the 18-month mark. I want to tell you honestly, sitting at that kitchen table, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of pride watching my own son operate at a level of sophistication I'd never reached myself, and underneath that pride, if I'm being completely truthful, a quiet hope that helping him with this deal might be a way of finally being part of the world he'd built for himself, rather than simply the father who'd sent him off into it from a tow yard office years earlier. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. I brought the promissory note to Kimberly before I signed anything, which I want you to understand was already, for me, a meaningful act of caution, because I trusted her financial judgment more than my own on anything this large. She read through it carefully at her own kitchen table, and her first reaction was concern, though carefully worded, the way she's always been careful not to sound like she's simply competing with her brother. "Dad," she said, "this looks reasonable on paper, but I want to see the actual purchase contract for the property itself, and I want to know who the other investors are and whether any of this has actually closed yet, or whether Bryce is still assembling the capital." I brought that concern back to Bryce, and he had an answer ready, the same smooth fluency I'd come to associate with how he discussed every deal, an answer that made perfect sense at the time and only much later revealed itself as exactly the kind of answer a man gives when he's anticipated the question and rehearsed the response. Kimberly's cautious by nature, he told me, which is a good quality in an accountant, but real estate moves fast, Dad, and if I wait around getting every family member's accountant to sign off before I close, I lose the deal to someone less encumbered. I can show you the letter of intent, I can show you my projected numbers, but I need you to trust me the way you trust any deal you'd have made yourself back at the yard, on your own read of the person sitting across from you. I signed 4 days later, wiring $120,000 from my retirement account into an account Bryce had set up for what he called the Owasso Commons acquisition entity. For the first several months, everything appeared to function exactly as promised. I received a quarterly interest payment right on schedule, a modest but real return that landed in my checking account precisely when the promissory note said it would, the kind of small, consistent proof that quiets whatever quiet doubt might otherwise be building underneath a father's pride in his son. The first real crack came about 10 months in, when the second quarterly payment arrived 9 days late, with an apologetic text from Bryce explaining a temporary cash flow timing issue related to a tenant build-out at the property, nothing structural, he assured me, just the ordinary friction of managing a renovation project. I let it go. Real estate, I told myself, the same way I'd once told myself things about engines that turned out to be more serious than I wanted them to be, has cash flow timing issues all the time. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. It was Kimberly who noticed the actual pattern, not because she was suspicious of Bryce specifically, but because of the meticulous, almost reflexive way she reviews financial documents for anyone in the family who asks her to look at something, the same instinct that makes her genuinely excellent at her job. I'd mentioned the late payment to her in passing, the way you mention a minor annoyance rather than a real concern, and she asked, simply, if she could see the full property records for Owasso Commons, the actual county deed and tax records, just out of professional curiosity. What she found, over the following week, working through public records on her own time without telling Bryce she was looking, was that no property matching the description Bryce had given me had ever actually transferred ownership in Owasso during the relevant time frame. There was a strip center at the address he described, but county records showed it had been owned by the same commercial holding company for the preceding 11 years, with no sale, no transfer, no renovation permits filed, nothing at all matching the deal Bryce had described to me in such specific, confident detail 16 months earlier. Kimberly came to my house on a Tuesday evening, the folder of public records printed out and organized the way she organizes everything, and she sat across from me at my own kitchen table with an expression I hadn't seen on her since she was a teenager delivering bad news she genuinely didn't want to be the one delivering. "Dad," she said, "I need you to look at something, and I need you to understand I'm not doing this to hurt Bryce. I'm doing this because I think you need the actual facts before you send him another dollar." I sat with those property records for a long time, the same particular stillness I imagine settles over any man discovering that a story he trusted completely simply doesn't match the world as it actually exists. I asked Kimberly the only question that mattered in that moment. If the property was never actually purchased, where has my $120,000, and the interest payments I've been receiving, actually been going? Kimberly didn't have a full answer yet, but she had enough of a professional hunch to recommend a specific next step, one I want to walk you through because I think it matters to anyone watching who might find themselves trusting a family member's investment pitch without the independent verification they'd insist on from a stranger. She recommended I hire a forensic accountant, someone entirely separate from her own practice to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, to trace the actual flow of funds from the moment I'd wired that $120,000. That forensic accountant, a careful, understated man named Walter Priest who'd spent years working fraud cases for a regional bank before going independent, took about 3 weeks to build a complete picture, working from bank statements Bryce had voluntarily shared months earlier as part of the original promissory note documentation, records that, once actually traced transaction by transaction rather than simply glanced at, told an entirely different story than the one I'd been living inside. For over a year. My $120,000 had never gone toward any property acquisition at all. It had gone, within the first 6 weeks, almost entirely into a series of transfers to 2 different online sports betting platforms and 1 cryptocurrency exchange, interspersed with smaller transfers back out that Walter identified as classic markers of a chasing pattern, a gambler moving between platforms trying to recover losses with increasingly larger bets. The kind of pattern that consumes capital far faster than any legitimate business venture ever could. The quarterly interest payments I'd received, it turned out, hadn't come from any rental income or property appreciation at all. They'd come from the second and third private investors Bryce had also solicited using the same Owasso common story, their principal contributions cycling through to cover interest obligations owed to earlier investors, the exact structural signature, Walter told me plainly, of what regulators call a Ponzi arrangement, whether or not Bryce had ever consciously set out to build one that way from the very beginning. I want you to understand what that actually meant, sitting with it in my own kitchen at 69 years old. My son hadn't simply made a bad real estate bet that went sideways. He'd fabricated an entire investment, an entire property, an entire narrative of deal-making sophistication, in order to fund a gambling habit that had apparently been quietly consuming his finances for considerably longer than 16 months, using his own father's retirement savings, and at least 2 other families' money besides, to keep the whole structure from collapsing under its own weight before he found a way to actually win enough back to cover it. I didn't call Bryce that night. I've learned, over a long life running a business built on other people's worst days, that a man who confronts a crisis in its first raw hour almost always confronts his own fear rather than the actual facts in front of him, and I needed considerably more of the actual facts before I decided how to move. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. Kimberly and I spent the following 2 weeks, alongside Walter Priest, building the complete picture before either of us said a single word to Bryce directly. Walter identified, through the same forensic tracing, that there were at least 2 other private investors, both longtime family friends rather than strangers, who had each contributed similar amounts under the exact same Owasso common story, meaning the actual scope of what Bryce had built extended well beyond just his own father's retirement account, into the finances of people who trusted him specifically because of his relationship to our family. I asked Kimberly, directly, how she thought I should handle the fact that other families were exposed to this same situation, families who hadn't yet discovered what she and I already knew. That's where my daughter showed me something about her own character I don't think I'd ever fully appreciated until that moment. She didn't hesitate for a second. "Dad," she said, "we have to tell them. I know that makes this bigger and harder and probably means Bryce faces real consequences beyond just a difficult conversation with you, but those families deserve the same chance you just got, to understand what's actually happening with their money before it's too late to do anything meaningful about it. I want to be completely honest with you about how difficult that decision actually was, because I know some of you watching might expect a father in my position to want to quietly protect his son from the widest possible consequences, to handle everything as privately as possible and simply absorb the loss myself rather than exposing Bryce to more people, more scrutiny, potentially more serious legal jeopardy. I felt that pull too, genuinely, sitting in my kitchen turning the decision over. But underneath that pull was a clearer, harder truth I couldn't argue my way around. Protecting Bryce from the consequences of what he'd actually done to other families wasn't love. It was the same kind of enabling that had probably let his gambling problem grow large enough, over however many years, to eventually require $120,000 of his father's retirement money and at least 2 other families' trust to sustain it. Walter helped Kimberly and me draft a careful, factual letter to the other 2 investor families, laying out exactly what the forensic tracing had revealed, without accusation beyond the documented facts themselves, recommending they consult their own independent financial advisors and, if they chose, legal counsel, before any further payments were made or accepted under the existing promissory notes. We arranged to speak with Bryce the following week, at my house, the same kitchen table where he'd first laid out that folder 16 months earlier. Kimberly was there. Walter was present as well, at my specific request, not as an aggressive presence but as someone who could speak precisely to the actual financial trail if questions arose that I couldn't answer with full accuracy myself. Bryce arrived expecting, I believe, an ordinary family dinner conversation, perhaps an update on the quarterly interest payment that was, by that point, considerably overdue. He did not expect to walk in and find Walter Priest sitting at the table with a folder of bank records, or the particular expression on his sister's face. "Dad, what's going on?" he said, glancing between the three of us, clearly recalibrating in real time. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, the same deliberate pause I'd learned mattered more than any raised voice in a moment like this one. "Bryce," I said, "I want to talk about Owasso Commons. Specifically, I want to talk about the fact that no property matching what you described to me has ever changed hands at that address, according to 11 straight years of county records." I watched something drain out of my son's face in that moment, the particular collapse of a man realizing, in real time, that the story he'd been maintaining for 16 months had finally run out of road to keep running on. He tried, in the first few minutes, a version where the deal had simply fallen through early on and he'd meant to tell me, had just been waiting for the right moment, still believed he could make things right through other opportunities he had in the pipeline. Walter, quietly, slid the forensic transaction summary across the table, the sports betting transfers, the cryptocurrency exchange activity, the chasing pattern laid out in dates and dollar amounts that left no room for any version of events beyond the one the numbers actually told. That version didn't survive contact with the documents either, and I think some part of Bryce understood, watching his sister's face across that table, that there wasn't actually a version left to try. "You used Dad's retirement money to gamble," Kimberly said, quietly, her voice steadier than I think even she expected it to sound in that moment. "And when that money ran out, you brought in 2 other families using the exact same story, to keep covering interest payments on money that was never invested in anything real to begin with." Bryce didn't argue with any of it. What came out instead, over the following half hour, was something closer to a genuine, halting confession than anything I'd expected walking into that conversation. He told us the gambling had started years earlier, quietly, manageably at first, the kind of thing he'd always believed he could control because he understood odds and probability professionally in ways he assumed gave him some real edge over an ordinary gambler. He told us the losses had grown slowly, then considerably faster, and that somewhere in the process of trying to dig himself back out using increasingly larger bets, the idea of the Owasso Commons story had presented itself less as a deliberate fraud from the outset and more as what felt, in the moment, like a temporary bridge, a way to access capital quickly that he genuinely believed, at the time, he'd be able to repay once his luck turned, a belief that kept extending itself further and further past any reasonable point of honesty. I want to be fair to my son in the telling of this, the same way I've tried to be fair to every difficult person in every version of this story I've ever told, because I don't believe Bryce woke up one morning 16 months ago deliberately plotting to defraud his own father and 2 family friends. I believe, based on everything Walter's forensic work and Bryce's own halting account revealed, that a private, escalating gambling problem had slowly consumed his judgment to the point where deception simply became the only remaining tool he had left to keep the whole structure from collapsing sooner than it eventually did. That understanding, though, didn't change what actually needed to happen next. I want to tell you honestly what I did, because I know some of you watching might expect either total forgiveness or total severance, and what actually happened sits somewhere more complicated between those 2 extremes. I did not press criminal charges against my own son, a decision Kimberly and I discussed at length and one I know some people would have made differently in my position. What I did instead, working with Walter and a separate financial attorney, was require Bryce to formally acknowledge the full debt, $120,000 owed to me directly, structured as a legally binding, garnishable obligation against his future earnings, with mandatory participation in a documented gambling addiction treatment program as an explicit condition of that repayment structure remaining civil rather than becoming a matter I'd refer to law enforcement. For the other 2 investor families, I insisted, as a further condition, that Bryce personally and directly disclose the full truth to them himself, in person, rather than through any intermediary, and that he begin structuring restitution to them as well, ahead of any further payments back to me, since their exposure had come without the closeness of blood that had, at minimum, given me more reason to eventually uncover the truth than they'd ever had reason to suspect it themselves. Bryce entered a treatment program 6 weeks after that conversation, and I want to tell you, honestly, that I don't know yet how this ultimately resolves, because addiction, from everything I've read and everything Kimberly has helped me understand over these past several months, isn't a problem that resolves cleanly on any predictable timeline just because a family finally confronts it directly. What I can tell you is that he stayed in that program for the better part of 4 months now, has made 2 restitution payments toward the other families precisely on schedule, and calls me most Sundays, conversations that are considerably harder and more honest than anything we managed in the 16 months he was quietly managing a lie instead. Kimberly asked me once, a few weeks after that first difficult conversation at my kitchen table, why I hadn't simply confronted Bryce the moment she first showed me the county property records, why we'd spent 2 additional weeks building the complete forensic picture with Walter before either of us said a word to him directly. Because half a truth would have let him hand us half a confession, I told her, and I needed the whole truth in front of him before he had any room left to keep managing the story instead of finally facing it. I think about that folder of paperwork Bryce brought to Sunday dinner 16 months ago sometimes, the confident language of cap rates and off-market opportunities that I'd been so quietly proud to hear my own son speak fluently. I understand now that fluency was never actually about real estate at all. It was about a man who'd become skilled, out of necessity, at telling a story convincing enough to buy himself just a little more time, one investor, one family member, one quarterly payment at a time, until the story finally ran into a daughter with the patience and the professional instinct to check whether the underlying facts actually held up. I still have my house, my salvage yard sold years ago now into a comfortable retirement, though considerably less comfortable than it was before that $120,000 left my account. I've rebuilt what I can rebuild, slower now at 69 than I could have managed at 39, and I've learned, the hard way, at an age when I genuinely believed I'd already learned every hard lesson life intended to teach me, that trust in a child's competence and trust in a child's honesty are 2 entirely separate things, and a father does himself and his family no favors confusing one for the other, no matter how much easier that confusion feels in the moment he's choosing to believe it. There's a part of this story I haven't told you yet, because I think it matters just as much as the confrontation itself. About 3 months after that first conversation at my kitchen table, Kimberly came by on a weeknight, the same table again, the one that seems to hold every difficult conversation this family has ever needed to have. She sat down across from me with a look I'd learned to recognize by then, the look she gets when she's spent real time thinking something through before deciding to say it out loud. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to feel guilty about it, because that's not why I'm telling you. I almost didn't check those property records. I want you to understand that. I almost let it go, the way you did, because Bryce has always been so confident, and I didn't want to be the sister who assumes the worst about her own brother just because I run numbers for a living and he doesn't." I asked her what had actually made her check, in the end, since she'd mentioned before that it started as simple professional curiosity rather than suspicion. "It was the late payment," she said. "Not the amount, not even really the excuse he gave you. It was how quickly and smoothly the excuse came, like he'd already rehearsed it before you'd even asked the question. I've reviewed enough small business finances over the years to know what a genuine cash flow hiccup sounds like from an honest business owner, and what a rehearsed explanation sounds like from someone managing a story instead of a business. That's the only reason I looked. Not distrust of Bryce specifically. Just a professional instinct I trained myself to notice, and almost talked myself out of trusting that one time. I think about that conversation more than almost anything else in this whole story, because it taught me something about my daughter I hadn't fully appreciated until she said it out loud. Kimberly hadn't caught Bryce because she was naturally suspicious of her own brother. She'd caught him because she'd built, over years of careful professional practice, the discipline to notice the difference between an honest explanation and a rehearsed one, and she'd been willing, even against her own instinct to give her brother the benefit of the doubt, to follow that discipline all the way through to an uncomfortable, family-altering conclusion. I asked her, that same evening, whether she resented me at all for having trusted Bryce so completely in the first place, for having wired $120,000 to my own son without ever once asking her, or anyone else outside the family, to independently verify a single detail of what he described. "No, Dad," she said, without hesitation. You trusted your son the way a father is supposed to be able to trust his son. That's not a failure on your part. The failure was entirely his, choosing to build something to exploit exactly that trust. I just happen to be built a little more suspicious of paperwork than you are, and thank God for that, this time. Bryce and I talk most Sundays now, the way I mentioned, and those conversations have slowly become less about the debt itself and more about the actual work he's doing in his recovery program, the mechanics of what drove the gambling in the first place, patterns he's only now, in his late 30s, starting to genuinely understand rather than simply manage around. He asked me, a few weeks ago, whether I thought our relationship could ever fully return to what it was before that folder of Owasso Commons paperwork landed on my kitchen counter 16 months earlier. I told him honestly that I didn't think it should return to exactly what it was before, because what it was before included a version of trust that turned out to be far too easy for him to exploit once things got hard enough for him personally. What I told him I hoped for instead was something sturdier, built the slow way, the way I built the salvage yard itself all those years ago, one honest transaction at a time, rather than the kind of trust that gets handed over whole in a single evening because a son sounds confident enough at his own father's kitchen table. He didn't argue with that. I think, somewhere in these past several months of treatment and restitution and considerably harder Sunday phone calls, he's come to understand it's the more honest offer either of us actually has left to make each other, and honestly, at 69 years old, having learned what I've learned this past year and a half, I've decided that's a good deal more valuable to me now than the 40% return he once promised on a property that never existed at all. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you for being a part of Revenge Confirmed.